I'm like not at all ready for this. I had to Google what PC culture was this morning.
In the fall of 2016, I began my college experience at Clark University. I was 18, had an undercut, spent more time on the internet than hanging out with friends, and I was the most PC I've ever been. I've changed a lot since then. My freshman orientation was the first year that Clark, along with several other colleges, employed a microaggressions workshop.
Microaggression, a statement, action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group such as a racial or ethnic minority.
I had thought it was cool. I was proud of the university I chose for being so progressive. A week later, Clark was featured in a New York Times article.
The New York Times, a colleague of yours, was featured, the chief diversity officer. At Clark, incoming freshmen, we're not supposed to say freshmen either, incoming first-year students should not use the term you guys, because that apparently suggests that people like you are excluded.
I don't trust that the New York Times article really represented the complexity of what went into that training. So I understand that a list of words might have been used in some way, but outside of the broader context of the way in which the students were engaged in that conversation, I'm not sure that the New York Times got it right.
Context or no, Eric, why should the chief diversity officer, if he or she in your case is going to speak at all, not say, hey, all you people, not you guys, be respectful and civil in your conversations?
I've spent the past 4 years learning what it means to be politically correct, to think about the things I say and why I say them, to question what others say, to look at language as a whole through a critical lens. Words of history and power, and yes, sticks and stones may break your bones, but words can reinforce oppressive ideologies.
Political correctness, the avoidance of forms of expression or action that are perceived to exclude, marginalize, or insult groups of people who are socially disadvantaged or discriminated against.
The words you choose matter. They impact those around you, and you should speak up when someone says something that isn't right. Treat others respectfully. That's what PC culture represents. But is it possible to go overboard? Can you be too politically correct?
I feel like political correctness is kind of a misnomer for being a decent person.
We're taught as little kids, do unto others as you would have do unto you. The concept of being, politically correct is at the very core of human nature.
Using somebody's preferred pronouns or refraining from saying slurs is not really political correctness. It's just, basic human decency.
I feel like the word political correctness itself gets replaced by a lot of privileged people that don't understand marginalization.
It's a human right to be able to define yourself and to create the language yourself for the group that you belong to and expect others to respect and follow that language.
I think that using language to not hurt other people is a good thing, but I also think the problem with being too PC comes when you're aggressively policing the people around you to the point where they don't really feel comfortable expressing their own beliefs or using whatever language they know how to use.
When people first started talking about being more aware of what you're saying and how it affects people, that is inherently a good thing. But now I feel like, and maybe it's because living at a college campus can be very much such a bubble, I often feel like it has become so much so where I constantly am feeling like I'm walking on eggshells. And I feel like I'm always worried, if I leave a conversation with someone who I don't really know, are they gonna take what I've said and spin it out of, context just because it doesn't fall into maybe the realm of politically correct, or maybe it might just be as simple as it doesn't agree with that person's point of view, but does that make it a bad thing?
I think a lot of the 2PC stuff comes from not giving people room to grow because people obviously come from different environments.
I definitely understand the frustration of some people being I genuinely don't have the resources and the information about this, but I know that this is not right. They sincerely don't know how to say some words and like how to, you know, approach certain topics, and like that's understandable. But I also, you know, sometimes people like punish other people for like the tiniest mistakes, and then also like perceive that as like a hate for the whole community.
CNN can report that Hillary Clinton has called Donald Trump to concede the race.
I vividly remember the night Trump won. All of the girls on my floor gathered in the common room and stared at the TV as the results crept in. Some were crying, some called their parents in panic, some had to leave because of the stress, and we were all terrified. The next morning, a group of baseball players ran around the halls, cheering for Trump. They were the only happy people I saw that day. A week later, a hate message was written in a bathroom stall. When my dad found out my grandmother voted for Trump, he said he wished he had known so we could have talked her out of it. She told him there was nothing he could have said to change her mind, so he told her I was gay. I think, for a split second, she regretted her vote.
Since Donald Trump has been elected, we're in a crisis mode in this country where people are quick to jump onto something and say, wait a minute, we can't say this. And I don't blame them.
I feel like it's weird that like the discourse on it is like you're either on one side or the other. Like you can't, you know, you're either full on like anti political correctness, or like you're fully just super inclusive to all the possible, you know, causes, and it's just like that's not how life works.
It's hard to be friends with someone who is aggressive because you really don't feel like you can share like your viewpoints and say what you think. And like personally, I would always kind of just be worried about being labeled as a bad person when like that's not who I am.
I actually left a club because I couldn't handle what was being said about me behind my back. And a lot of it had to do with, I think, just misconceptions. Like nobody ever sat me down and said, hey, is this true? Or, hey, like I've heard these things about you, like can you provide some context?
For this interview, I did a lot of like thought prior to it and also a lot of thinking during it about what I'm saying, because I am nervous about how I will be perceived to people watching this, because I think that people should listen to other people instead of just like write them off immediately, which I think is kind of sad.
I mean, yeah, like I told you a lot of times before with like asking people to do interviews for this, that like I was like super nervous about like what if people hear that I'm talking about being PC and they're immediately like, no, this is already, I can tell, going to be problematic. I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah,
that's
definitely.
in the back of our minds. It's kind of messed up.
I do think it's messed up because I don't think that you should be afraid. Like, that's exactly the problem. Like, I'm afraid to say what I think about this because I think that either people won't listen to me or they'll take the things I say without listening to the context, and they'll just assume that, like, I'm something that I'm not, which I think is really unfair.
The people that said the really nasty things were the people absolutely preaching the whole, you know, you cannot step a hair out of, like, line and say something that hurts or offends somebody.
If it's a small enough thing, then it's like, whatever, I'll let it go. But if they do some BS, I'm like, I'm gonna pop off on you because I'm never gonna have to see you or deal with you again. So I'm gonna teach you your goddamn lesson and walk away.
Someone asks my husband and I, who's the man and who's the woman in the relationship? I can sort of calmly explain that's inappropriate. But there was a point in my life where that was painful. That triggered me. And I probably yelled.
Arguing with other people about social justice related issues, I think part of it is stubbornness, but also I'm very loyal. I'm very like die hard. And it's like, especially if I know I'm like right about something, then I'm going steadfast into that. I'm going head first. Like even if I'm going to crash into a wall, I'm going head first.
Sometimes I am like rationally very well aware that people just like don't know, like just genuinely don't know, don't think about it, don't have to think about it, and say things that are just like so terrible and offensive and ableist. It's just like, you know, and then like I will go home and then I'll be very angry for like 20 minutes and then I'll text my partner and I'll be like, fuck, like this is so terrible, why people do this? And then I'll be like I know, you know, it's fine. Like I can either stay angry or I can say something about it and be like, I get why you say this, but there's other ways to approach it.
Like I had a conversation with my parents a couple of years ago at dinner when we were talking about like they, them pronouns specifically. And they were just like expressing that like they didn't understand why that was a thing or like how that worked, especially because of like the plural singular thing that a lot of people don't understand. And I was pretty pissed off at them because I was like, wow, you are not accepting, this is terrible. And then eventually my mom was just like, no, like if you brought anybody, like if you invited a friend over and they use they, them pronouns, like we wouldn't treat them any differently. We would be like completely accepting to them.
I think on both sides, people are so quick to just say, well, you're a bad person.
I wish that these things didn't bother me as much as they did, but also they're attacking me, they're attacking other people. They're making the world a worse place. And I'm a fighter, like I'm like ridiculously defensive. I can get ridiculously defensive and protective.
I think for people who like boast and like make it part of their like brand, so to speak, to be extremely PC and to correct anybody and to not be afraid to confront people, but are also the same kind of people who if you ask them about what they think or confront them, they become very defensive and just like won't take it. I think that that's like honestly a perfect example of like what I see is like a massive problem right now everywhere, but like particularly at Clark, is that people refuse to listen to each other.
We are all human. We all say things that we shouldn't say, or we all say things that hurt other people. So to like lambaste somebody and go off on someone, and like the idea of like cancel culture as a result of this. But those same people will absolutely say things, talk about people behind their backs.
It was funny, I accused one of my, I didn't accuse my professor of anything. I called her out in the middle of class because she was being really binary in her language. This is a gender class, by the way. And I said, yo, can we not talk about things like cervical cancer and breast cancer as if they only apply to women? Because like I'm here, there are at least 2 other people in the room that also are in this boat with me.
If you're in a class and you have a young professor who's a professor of color or queer or of a marginalized positionality or who is untenured, and you are, you're a student, you in some ways have more power than that particular professor. And so if you're utilizing that power over this professor, then that's problematic, using that call out.
I went to my first Pride with my straight best friend Rachel. We took the T into Boston, found a spot near the beginning of the parade, and watched under the hot sun as all sorts of queer folks proudly marched down the street. About halfway through, a radical queer group stopped in front of our section, sat down on the ground, and began protesting. They were anti-corporation and anti-cop. People in the crowd started yelling, some in favor of the group and some against. Most people were against them, actually. I was scared and I didn't know what to think. I'm still not sure what I think. Elizabeth Warren was also at that Pride, and I remember seeing her without any signs, and I had to do a double take when I realized it was her. Then she waved at me. That was the highlight of my day. March 2020, I voted for Bernie Sanders in the presidential primary, despite thinking Warren would make a better president. I didn't want to get yelled at by Bernie supporters. I didn't want people to tell me I was a bad person for voting Warren.
I don't know, I feel like with aggression and like pressure and shame and punishment, like that never works. And I feel like if you just kind of prohibit people from saying something or from like referring to somebody in a certain way, it doesn't really solve the problem. It just makes them feel very, very bad.
I mean, I think that there are a lot of people who have really good intentions and they're like super accepting people, but sometimes they're just not aware of like the terms or like the politically correct things that another person feels that they should be saying. And I think that there's a way where you can just politely correct someone and explain to them like why what they're saying may be hurtful to you. But you can do that in a way that is not aggressive, because I think if you're aggressive and you're sort of like verbally attacking the other person, it sort of undermines the point of being politically correct, because at least to me, the whole point of that is just being accepting of other people.
I think it's important to recognize that people want to grow, because a lot of times when people make mistakes, they're not trying. Sometimes a lot of the microaggressions, people aren't trying to be assholes. It just kind of happens.
I've been trying to train family and friends. Let's eradicate the saying, that's the pot calling the kettle black. That's something that people think of as harmless, but it's not. It can have racist connotations. And so I'm always happy to learn when something that I may say that I don't know is hurtful or harmful to other people.
But I think there's a way where you can control that growth in terms of being like, hey, say this thing next time. If it happens again though, then like, we're done.
It's very important to remember that it starts kind of from bottom up. And like when, for instance, I stopped using the words like insane and crazy and sick, because I was like, that's not cool, I don't want to do that. People around me started to like noticing that and doing that less, which was really cool.
I was having a conversation with a friend, and I was kind of just like getting frustrated about a situation, like it had nothing to do with them, and it was dealing with another friend scenario, and I was venting to this person, and I was saying, I said something to the effect of like, oh, she's crazy, you know, she's acting crazy, and they just like, it was as if I had said that something like horribly egregious, or I had made some sort of like, I said something derogatory or something. Like the way that they reacted was so violently like, how could you say that? That is not okay. Like you cannot just throw that term around. You know, I did not use that term in a way to, you know, demean some people with mental health issues. I'm someone with mental health issues. So, you know, it felt to me very like, whoa, this is like not a reaction I anticipated or that I thought was warranted.
I feel like it's important to like be aware of what connotations that carries, especially when describing objects and like events, you know, like that was a sick party, you know, like sure, whatever. But like when talking about people, like hundreds of years of like forced sterilization and forced institutionalization, forcefully putting people in the institution, and every time I hear somebody say it, it just like pops into my head every time, and it's also kind of, it's, you know, language kind of forms relationships that we have with each other and with other people, and it has a lot of power to like set other people apart and like create distance and also create like proximity and intimacy for sure. But I feel like when you start kind of studying why, you know, certain things are uncomfortable for people to hear or like straight up offensive, you kind of get at like systems of oppression, and you kind of start realizing your own privilege and power, and kind of you know, the privilege and power that other people hold or like don't hold.
You can't really have a normal conversation with somebody who's gonna like absolutely pick apart every little thing you're saying.
I see language as being key to obtaining structural change.
If somebody tells you this is how I identify, I would never say something, I would never like intentionally then say something to hurt that person based on that. But I will say you guys until the day I die. Like I always say that, and I think a lot of people do.
In the gay community, if you're like, oh bitch to somebody, then like, that's normal. That's like you're just talking to your friend. So why is like some like little like white middle class cis het girl trying to be like, don't say that, it's offensive, and like being all crybaby about it, when I'm just like, but you're not understanding the context of which it's used. If you don't want me to call you that, then you can ask me and I'll call you that. That's fine. I won't do it.
As a gay man, I cannot interact with other members of society if they are calling me a fag, right? I have to be able to define the terminology for myself before I can engage in political conversations and political discourses.
So I had always grown up like the term that like the doctor used, whatever, was like hearing impaired.
Yeah.
And then I saw a few years ago this one thing online when people were like, you shouldn't say that because that like implies that there's like something wrong with you or whatever. So, like it's like a weird thing like to acknowledge like there are other people who are like, yes, I can't hear at all or that well, and I'm proud of that, and I'm like, I want nothing to do with, like if I could fix it, I would.
Yeah. The important part is kind of just like listening to people, to like particular cases. Because, you know, some people identify as Crip, you know, but some people obviously find that offensive. And so it's like some people prefer hard of hearing and some people prefer, you know, hearing impaired. So it's like, it's tough. And so that's why I'm mostly like, I go cry in my room for like 20 minutes, but then I come back and I'm like, I get it, you know, like it's tough.
When you're talking about something like political correctness, there is a whole conversation about, okay, but then where do you draw the line? Because, like, where do you draw the line?
Ralph was sick, a sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious, a sickness of the mind. You see, Ralph was a homosexual.
My first actual film project was a documentary about queer representation on TV. I was so sick and tired of gay characters being villainized, getting sad endings, and getting killed over and over and over again. I was angry, and I desperately wanted to do something about it. To a large majority of people who saw my documentary, this was the first they had heard of the problems I pointed out, the problems that impacted me and the way I saw myself, and how millions of other people saw themselves and how others saw me, and I could have just yelled at anyone I encountered that didn't get it. I could have let my anger get the better of me and written them off as bad people for not knowing what I knew all too well. I think that's how cancel culture got started. Imagine if every movie or TV show that killed a gay character had to start with a disclaimer. That's the world I created for myself. It was exhausting, but felt necessary to protect my sanity. I still do that now, though much less.
What's that club called? Cups?
Cups.
Can I talk about them specifically?
I'm planning on like including screenshots from the emails and stuff, so.
Okay, I'm gonna say, so another example I can think of is list of trigger warnings.
The concept of trigger warnings.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or not, but the What's Happening emails, which only this year started putting trigger warnings.
Oh, I noticed that.
And some of them make sense.
Yeah.
But then you have others that, for example, they have trigger warnings for Halloween Town.
That's wild.
Yeah.
I have noticed that too. I love Halloween Town, man. What the heck? There's nothing in that movie that's offensive. That's such a wholesome movie. What the heck?
So this is for the movie Julie and Julia.
The cooking movie?
Yes.
Jesus Christ.
So trigger warnings, dog death, makes sense. Food/cooking, sexual content, mention of virginity, swearing, eating, blood, mention of death, mention of 9/11,
Julie and Julia?
Domestic dispute, interrogation, jump scare, homophobia.
In Julie and Julia? Is this still the same film?
Alcohol consumption.
What?
Partial nudity.
What?
And the cherry on top, the McCarthy era.
Oh, that's a trigger for everybody, you know. Oh my god, yeah.
To say like trigger, like eating, like what? Like, do you not do that in your like everyday life?
You know, with the eating part, I can definitely agree. Like a little personal history. I like suffer with like an eating disorder, and it's tough. And seeing somebody eat is like hard, especially if it's very like super detailed, like super graphic. You know, if it's like a close up of somebody eating, like that is not. And like my body just reacts poorly. So like I can understand that, but I would just rephrase that in like not being like food and cooking, but I don't know what it would be, cause yeah. The McCarthy is just, I don't know. I don't think anybody of us, I don't know.
Because I think it's completely fair to list trigger warnings for like really like big traumatic topics that like sexual assault, suicide, rape, stuff like that. But I've seen lists of trigger warnings that are so extensive to the point where they're picking apart like the most like minute things. And I think that something like that I viewed as too PC, and that it sort of undermines the point of the trigger warnings.
I totally understand, like, if there's suicide in a movie, you might want to warn people, hey, by the way, this is a sensitive topic. I just watched a documentary on Netflix. It's the one about that horrific child abuse case. And that's a very hard topic for a lot of people to. It made me cry, and I was not abused as a child. I haven't had those, but that upset me to my core. I can imagine that severely upsetting somebody who might have unfortunately witnessed or been someone that's gone through something like that. And so, like, in instances where there are absolutely times where I feel like you should warn people about the content of something before they view it.
By like bookending rape with like farting and spitting, stuff like that is sort of just like a disservice to the entire concept. And I think just makes light of it in a way that they're not meaning to.
It creates like a hierarchy of like whose pain matters and like whose trauma matters. And it's like, you know, there are those like they will recognize, you know, people suffer from PTSD, you know, suicide survivors, domestic abuse survivors, like those are the ones that matter, but like eating disorders don't.
What a weird digression. Like, you know, to just go through that list and then you'll see like I think most of us would be able to pick out the ones that make sense, and the rest, I almost think like by doing that, I think you could distract somebody from seeing, you know, something like suicide and missing that because you're distracted by all the nonsense.
The beauty and the terror of trigger warnings is that like there's so many. Yeah, because I can definitely see how like most of those that you mentioned like could be uncomfortable for somebody, but also it does sound kind of ridiculous. So I don't know how to, you know, what to make of that. Also, probably should put the trigger warning on this part of your interview.
Some of my friends sent a screenshot of a tweet to our group chat. The tweet calls out the term crackhead for being problematic, and there was a reply that the word sketchy is equally bad. This sparked an hour-long conversation in which my friends and I debated whether or not sketchy was actually a problematic word, and whether or not it made sense in response to the original tweet. There was no final verdict reached. Two of us thought one thing, two of us thought another. The answer to our debate doesn't really matter, but what I think does matter is this message.
I think a big thing is that it's easy to feel like people are being too PC when they pick apart the language you use personally. Like for me, using crackhead doesn't feel PC enough because I don't feel comfortable using it myself, and I'm kind of confused as to why anyone does. But I use sketchy all the time and have forever. So when someone tells me not to use the word sketchy, I feel like they're being too PC because they're policing the language I have used frequently and have never had an issue with.
The general consensus is that yes, you can be too PC, and that happens when you start policing language without having a dialogue with the person you're criticizing. But how do we know which words should be policed? Who decides what words are and are not okay to say? And I don't mean words like slurs, but words with more nuance. So Daria says she doesn't like when people use the word crazy to describe others because of the word's history. That's valid and makes perfect sense. But Joelle feels she has the right to use the word because that's part of most people's vocabulary, and if you ask her not to use it around you, she won't, but she won't erase it from her vocabulary either. I think that's valid too. So how do we decide who's right? Is there a right? My senior year got cut short. We're living in a pandemic, and it feels like the world is falling apart. Emotions are running high. People are depressed, struggling, and lonely, and the government is doing nothing to help the problem. In fact, the government is making things worse.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China.
They'd rather let millions die than hurt their wallets. And we have no choice but to make the internet our primary source of communication, where anyone can say what they think in whatever way they want to say it. So it makes sense that right now, when people see or hear something they don't like, they might lash out in anger, in disgust, in terror. It makes it hard to edit because it feels so unimportant during COVID-19. Maybe this stuff does matter, though. Each interview boiled down to one key point: respect. Being PC in its purest form is about respecting others feelings, respecting their thoughts, respecting their right to healthcare, and respecting their right to exist. That's what matters. That's what PC culture is.
My fridge is really gonna bother you. It makes noises. I don't know what to tell you, man.
I don't care. I'm so...
There's no place for me to do this where it's gonna work because I can't leave this room.